Hello, this is Yuri Matsarsky and you are watching Look Up channel. Well, today we have a plan to compare Russia and the Gaza Strip, Vladimir Putin and Hamas. From the very beginning, I will note there are no speculations and exaggerations in these comparisons. The Putin gang and Hamas came to power in approximately the same way. They exploit the same narratives. They are equally corrupt, ineffective and cruel. So Vladimir Putin comes from the Soviet KGB, the main communist secret service. Anyone even slightly familiar with the history of the 20th century knows perfectly well that the KGB is responsible for the murders of huge number of very different people. Dissidents, human rights activists, members of the national movements. In fact, the KGB was a huge repressive apparatus, the main activity of which has always been the suppression, intimidation and destruction of all dissenters. Formally, with the collapse of the USSR, the KGB ceased to exist. However, organization was not banned and none of its executioners was convicted. These people retained their influence on domestic and foreign policy of post-Soviet Russia. And less than 10 years after the collapse of the USSR, they regained full power in the country. KGB protege Vladimir Putin used democratic tools to destroy democracy. He was elected in year 2000 in relatively fair and open elections, but the fact is that these were the last fair and open elections in the history of Russia. After these elections, Putin and his entourage did everything to ensure that voting would never again be unpredictable. They subjugated all the major TV channels in the country, they cancelled the elections of the heads of the regions, they killed several independent journalists and active critics of the authorities. Remember, for example, Alexander Litvinenko, who was poisoned with polonium, and Anna Politkovskaya, who was shot dead on Putin's birthday. And of course, it was they who ignited the war in Chechnya, on the blood and nightmares of which they built their ratings and earned their initial political capital. It was this war that Putin and his team used to consolidate Russian voters around them, made a horror story out of it, the main message of which was this: only we can protect you from terrible terrorists. Only we can defeat them. The alternative to us is endless chaos and blood. For Putin, the Chechen war was just a tool for coming to power and securing a foothold in it. For the sake of this, he did not spare either Russians or Chechens. He easily scattered other people's lives and without hesitations gave the most terrible orders. Hamas came to power in the Gaza Strip in a similar way. It too received a mandate to rule in quite fair elections. And just like Putin, it sold itself to voters as the only alternative to chaos and nightmare, the offer of which was this organization itself. The inhabitants of the Gaza Strip, just like the Russians, willingly believed in the story about a strong hand that would restore order and readily voted for Hamas. Those who did not agree with this choice were either expelled from the Gaza Strip or killed or intimidated by Hamas fighters. And they did not stop at anything at all. For example, one of the favorite tactics for dealing with opponents in the organization was the kidnapping of these opponents, followed by the amputation of their arms and legs. Of course, very soon there were no public critics of Hamas left. Putin and Hamas operate in a political system purged of opponents and critics, both of them exploiting the population's fear of war they themselves are waging. Free media, freedom of speech and political competition would not have given either Putin or Hamas a chance to stay in power for so long. Voters would quickly understand that a crowd of thieves and gangsters had gathered in power, and they needed to get rid of these gangsters as soon as possible. So the authorities of both Russia and the Gaza Strip need a society which is as uneducated as possible, superstitious and isolated from the outside world. That is why Putin's propaganda and Hamas paint this outside world as an absolute evil that must be kept away from. They invent some traditional values that they supposedly protect from the insidious West. They inflate xenophobia and pump people up with fear of foreigners. Moreover, both regimes are based on hatred of their neighbors. Hamas explicitly states that the main goal of the organization is the destruction of Israel. The Russian leadership is obviously obsessed with the idea of liquidating an independent Ukraine. Even economically, Hamas and Russia differ little from each other, in the sense that none of them even tried to create at least some effective modern economy focused on high-tech or service industries. Hamas lives almost exclusively on external sponsors like Iran, while Russian economy is based on the sale of oil, gas and other national resources abroad. If desired, it is possible and even necessary to put an equal sign between Putin's Russia and Hamas and treat Putin in the same way as they treat the leaders of this xenophobic and cannibalistic organization. But for some reason the world community does not have such a desire.